There is something disarming about her smile. A softness, a curiosity, a quiet light behind the eyes. Captured in 1940, in a black and white portrait taken at home in Amsterdam, an 11-year-old girl looks toward the camera, unaware that her face will one day become one of the most recognized in the world. Her name was Anneliese Marie Frank, but most know her simply as Anne. This is not the end of the attic, not yet the end of the diary, not the figure carved into textbooks and documentaries. This is the end before the hiding, before the horror, before history wrote her name in sorrow. In this photo, taken just months before everything began to unravel, and is still just a child, still dancing through the corridors of girlhood, still laughing too loudly, still writing stories no one would read, still safe, or at least believing she was. But the smile we see, it holds more than we realize. Because behind that smile is a storm coming. A storm that will sweep away her home, her freedom, her family, and eventually her life. And yet, that smile still speaks, still endures, still whispers across decades. This is the story of how that smile survived, even as the world collapsed around it. To understand, and we must rewind to the very beginning. And Frank was born on June 12, 1929, in Frankfurt, Germany. She arrived in a country already wounded from World War I, caught in the grip of economic crisis and rising political extremism. Her father, Otto Frank, was a quiet, thoughtful man, a banker, a reader, a believer in reason. Her mother, Edith, was more reserved, proper, religious, protective, and had an older sister, Margot, 3 years her senior. Margot was the golden child, obedient, studious, elegant, and, by contrast, was loud, restless, curious, always asking questions, always writing things down. But soon, the walls began to close in. In 1933, when Anne was just 4 years old, Adolf Hitler rose to power in Germany. The Nazis brought with them a tidal wave of anti-Semitic laws, propaganda, and violence. Jewish families like the Franks were pushed to the margins, stripped of their rights, hunted in their own country. Otto knew what was coming. Unlike many who stayed, hoping things would pass, he chose to leave. And so, in 1934, the Franks fled Germany and moved to Amsterdam, in the Netherlands. It was a city of canals and bicycles, of painters and poets, and for a time, it became a safe haven, and began to thrive. She learned Dutch quickly. She made friends. She told jokes. She went to school. She dreamed of being an actress or a writer. She scribbled stories in notebooks, wrote letters to imaginary friends, and soaked in everything around her with a sponge-like mind. And though war was again brewing in Europe, in Anne's world, life still felt full of color. That photo, the one taken in 1940, was captured during this fragile bubble of peace. But in May of that same year, that bubble shattered. Germany invaded the Netherlands. The country surrendered in days. The Nazis arrived in force, and the noose began to tighten again. It started with restrictions. Jews couldn't own businesses. Then they couldn't go to parks. Then they couldn't attend regular schools. Then they had to wear a yellow star on their clothes. Each new rule, each new line drawn, shrunk Anne's world smaller and smaller. In one of her early diary entries, she wrote, "Our freedom was severely restricted by a series of anti-Jewish decrees. Jews were required to wear a yellow star. Jews were required to turn in their bicycles. Jews were forbidden to use streetcars. Jews were forbidden to drive." But even as the world darkened and wrote, she documented everything. Her fear, her boredom, her dreams, her frustrations, her hunger for love, her desire to be heard. And perhaps this is what makes that 1940 photo so haunting. Because we now know what she didn't. We know what was waiting. We know that just 2 years later, on July 6, 1942, Anne and her family would vanish from public life. We know they would disappear into the secret annex, a hidden space behind Otto Frank's office building, where they would live in silence, fear, and darkness for 25 months. We know that and would keep writing, transforming her diary from a private journal into a record of existence, resistance, and hope. We know that after 2 years in hiding, they would be discovered, arrested, and deported. We know that and would eventually die of typhus in Bergen-Belsen concentration camp, likely in February or March of 1945, just weeks before the camp was liberated. And yet, when we look at that photo, that isn't the and we see. We see the girl before the diary, before the attic, before the camps. We see her smile, her confidence, her spark. And maybe that's what makes the image so powerful, because it captures a moment of pure, unknowing humanity. And Frank was not born to be a symbol. She was not born to be a martyr. She was a girl, a sister, a daughter, a storyteller. And this photo is her final portrait of freedom. But this is only the beginning, because behind that image is a story the world cannot afford to forget. A story that challenges us to remember not just how Anne died, but how she lived, and how, even as darkness closed in, she found a way to leave behind a light. It began with a gift, a simple, red and white checkered notebook, a birthday present for Anne's 13th birthday, on June 12, 1942. She held it close like a secret, even before it was filled. It wasn't just a journal. It was a friend, a mirror, a place where she could be loud, even in silence. She named it Kitty. I hope I will be able to confide everything to you, as I have never been able to confide in anyone, she wrote on the very first page. By then, the walls of Anne's world had already begun to close. That same month, just weeks after her birthday, her sister Margot received a notice to report to a Nazi labor camp. But Otto Frank knew the truth. Those camps weren't places people returned from. And so, on July 6, 1942, the Frank family disappeared into the shadows. They left behind their apartment, their neighbors, their schoolbooks, and stepped into the secret annex. The annex was a concealed space behind Otto's former office building at 263 Prinsengracht in Amsterdam. It was hidden behind a movable bookcase. There were steep staircases, tiny rooms, no fresh air, and never enough food. They had to be silent during the day. No shoes, no running water, no voices. Every footstep could betray them. And yet, inside that cramped space, Anne continued to write. She wrote when she was angry, when she was scared, when she was in love, when she was hopeless. She wrote about the fights with her mother, her sister's quiet sadness, her crush on Peter Van Pels, the teenage boy hiding in the attic above. She wrote about rationed food, lice, air raids, and the muffled footsteps of men in boots outside. She wrote about missing the sun. I can feel the sufferings of millions, and yet, if I look up into the heavens, I think that it will all come right. Even in her confinement, Anne never stopped believing the world could be better, that people, at their core, were still good. Her words spilled with longing, for normalcy, for beauty, for freedom. And through those words, Anne created something extraordinary. She turned captivity into creation, fear into reflection, imprisonment into literature. But Anne didn't just want to survive. She wanted to be remembered. One day, in 1944, Anne heard a radio broadcast from the Dutch government in exile. The speaker urged citizens to save personal documents, diaries, letters, essays, to help record what life was like under Nazi occupation. That broadcast lit something in her. From that moment forward, Anne began rewriting and editing her diary with a greater purpose. She wanted it to be published, to be read, to matter. I want to go on living even after my death, she wrote. She began shaping her entries, adding reflections, rearranging passages, not just to record her life, but to give it meaning. What teenager thinks like that? And yet, Anne was not an ordinary teenager. She lived in a world where childhood had been stolen, where laughter had become dangerous, and where hope itself was an act of rebellion. Every word she wrote was an act of defiance. The secret annex held not just the Frank family, but four others: Herman, Auguste, and Peter Van Pels. Fritz Pfeffer, a dentist and family acquaintance together. 8 people lived in silence for more than 2 years. They were kept alive by a handful of brave helpers on the outside. Miep Gies, B.E.P. Vosquigel, Victor Kugler, and Johannes Kleiman, who risked their lives every single day. These people brought food, supplies, news, and hope. But even hope grew thin. Anne's final diary entry is dated August 1st, 1944. Just 3 days later, on the morning of August 4th, the secret annex was stormed. The Nazis had been tipped off. To this day, no one knows who betrayed them. The 8 were arrested, their protectors interrogated, the diary left behind, and never wrote in it again. What followed was a descent into darkness. The group was taken to Westerbork, a transit camp in the Netherlands. From there, they were shipped east, packed into cattle cars, crushed among hundreds of other souls. They arrived at Auschwitz in early September 1944. The men and women were separated. Otto Frank, the father who had protected them, was torn from his daughters. And Margot and Edith were sent to the women's barracks. It was hell: disease, starvation, labor, death. Every day brought screams, smoke, and silence. But Anne and Margot still had each other. In October, the girls were transferred again. This time to Bergen-Belsen, a concentration camp in northern Germany. Conditions there were unspeakable. No sanitation, no medicine, no food. Typhus spread like wildfire. And Margot, already emaciated, caught the disease. Margot died first. Then Anne. Alone. Just 15 years old. No funeral. No marker. No goodbye. Her mother, Edith, had already died in Auschwitz. Her father, Otto, was the only one to survive. And when he returned to Amsterdam after the war, he was handed a stack of notebooks and loose papers. Miep Gies had found Anne's diary. She couldn't read it. She knew it wasn't hers to read. So she kept it safe, waiting for the day someone would return for it. And Otto did. He opened the pages and found a voice he thought he had lost forever. And Frank's diary was first published in 1947 under the title Het Achterhuis, The Secret Annex. It sold modestly at first. Then it spread. It was translated into dozens of languages, read in classrooms across continents, adapted into plays, films, and memorials. But no adaptation ever captures what the pages truly hold: the thoughts of a child in a collapsing world trying to make sense of it all. Anne's voice became immortal, not because she wanted fame, but because she wanted the world to listen, to remember, to change. And through that diary, she did. When we speak of Anne Frank, we often focus on her words. But what gets lost, what we try not to think about, is how her story ended. How a bright, brilliant girl was slowly extinguished in the cold machinery of a death camp. Because Anne didn't just pass away. She was erased, bit by bit, ration by ration, lice by lice, cough by cough. Her death was not swift. It was slow, cruel, invisibilized. When Anne and Margot arrived at Bergen-Belsen, their hair was crawling with lice. Their skin was covered in sores. They were barefoot, half-naked, freezing. They lived in filthy, overcrowded huts with no heating. They slept on straw sacks covered in excrement. They were surrounded by the dead and the dying. Food consisted of watery turnip soup and moldy bread, when it came at all. There was no medicine, no mercy, no mourning that didn't begin with screams. And still, Anne tried to survive. She clung to Margot, whispered memories of home, laughed at anything, a bird, a dream, a story, just to remember what it felt like to be human. But the body breaks down long before the soul does. Typhus is a monstrous disease, carried by lice, worsened by hunger. It causes fever, hallucinations, organ failure. By February 1945, Margot was too weak to stand. She fell from her bunk and never got up again, and followed days later. They were buried in a mass grave, nameless, voiceless, lost. Just a few weeks later, on April 15, 1945, the British Army liberated Bergen-Belsen. Had they held on just a little longer? But that's the cruelty of history. Hope dies inches from salvation. Anne's death wasn't just a tragedy, it was a theft. She could have become a writer, a teacher, a mother, a woman who looked back on horror and helped the world heal. But instead, she became a ghost with a pen, a symbol, a lesson, a name we whisper with reverence. Still, that's not all she was. And Frank was funny, sarcastic, flirtatious, sensitive, insecure, brave. She was annoyed by her mother. She felt misunderstood by the adults around her. She worried her writing wasn't good enough. She was alive, and that's what the Nazis tried to destroy, not just bodies, but personhood. But the diary they failed to burn made sure that wouldn't happen. Anne's words endured where her body couldn't. In the years after the war, Otto Frank became a guardian of his daughter's voice. He worked tirelessly to get her diary published, to show the world not just what was lost, but what was left behind. He edited the original manuscript gently, removing some intimate or critical passages, not to change her, but to protect her. He knew the world wasn't ready to see Anne fully. Not yet. But even in its earliest editions, the diary was electric. It struck a nerve. Here was a young girl, hiding from monsters, still dreaming of being loved, still dreaming of tomorrow. Despite everything, I still believe that people are really good at heart. That line, repeated endlessly in classrooms and documentaries, became the soul of the Holocaust for millions. Because in the face of genocide, Anne offered grace. But not everyone agreed. Over the decades, critics emerged. Some called her diary too innocent, too narrow, too optimistic. Others accused Otto of sanitizing it, of erasing Anne's complexity to make her more palatable, and had written about her body, her emerging sexuality, her questions about identity. And those parts were largely cut from early versions. In later editions, much of that was restored. Because Anne wasn't just a saint in hiding. She was a teenager, messy and real. And that's what makes her story even more important. It reminds us that the Holocaust didn't just kill 6 million Jews. It ended 6 million individual stories, each with dreams, flaws, secrets, and futures. And wasn't an idea. She was a girl. And every word she wrote was a refusal to disappear. Today, her face is everywhere. Her name is taught in schools. Her image used in human rights campaigns. Her diary translated into over 70 languages, read by more than 30 million people. The secret annex has been turned into a museum, a pilgrimage site for remembrance. Millions walk through those tight, suffocating rooms every year. They see the walls and once stared at, the photos of Hollywood stars she pasted near her bed, the scratch marks on the wallpaper that tracked her growth. They walk up the narrow staircase, through the hidden door, and into history. And still, it's not enough. Because even with all that, we risk turning Anne into a statue, a quote, a myth. But Anne Frank was not a symbol. She was a daughter, a sister, a writer, a witness. And if we truly want to honor her, we have to listen, not just read. Listen to the silence between the lines, to the fears she didn't write, to the lives that vanished with hers. Because in the end, the most haunting thing about Anne's story isn't how she died. It's how little the world changed after she did. What do we really hear when we read Anne Frank's diary? Is it the voice of a young girl trapped by hatred? Or is it something more? Something older, deeper, a human echo that rings through every generation. A warning, a whisper, a plea. Because the story of Anne Frank didn't end in 1945. It keeps happening, in different forms, different names, different languages. But always the same core, people hunted for who they are, locked away, silenced, forgotten. And always someone hoping, someone writing, someone dreaming of more. After the war, Otto Frank carried a unique burden. He wasn't just a grieving father. He was the only living voice who had known the annex as a home. He had watched and grow, argue, laugh. He had watched her change. And now he was responsible for sharing her with a world that would never meet her. Can you imagine that weight? Can you imagine opening a diary and seeing the handwriting of your dead child, telling jokes, confessing fears, describing your fights? Can you imagine reading her dreams for the future, knowing none of them would come true? Otto did that. And then he published it. Not because it was easy, but because he believed someone had to remember. He once said, "To build up a future, you have to know the past." But Otto wasn't alone in that mission. All around the world, survivors, many of them children, began to speak. Some through books, some through interviews, some through silent tears at memorials, and had become a symbol, yes. But her story also gave others the courage to tell their own. In Israel, a child named Elie Wiesel would grow into one of the most powerful voices of Holocaust memory. His book, Night, would become a companion to Anne's diary. Darker, more brutal, but equally essential. In America, schools began teaching and story in classrooms, often as the first introduction to the Holocaust for millions of children. And yet, with every generation, the fear remains. Will they remember? Or will the echo fade? In 1959, just over a decade after Anne's death, her story made it to Broadway. The play The Diary of Anne Frank debuted to critical acclaim. Audiences wept. Critics praised it. It brought Anne's voice to stages across the globe. But something happened in those adaptations. They softened her. They cut out the passages where she was angry, where she questioned religion, where she talked about her body, her desires, her frustrations. They made her more universal, which often meant more acceptable. And while millions were moved, something essential was lost, and wasn't meant to be a saint. She was a human, a full, complicated, flawed, radiant human. Over the years, her image became commodified. Souvenir shops near the Anne Frank house sold postcards, magnets, even Anne Frank bookmarks. Her face was turned into a brand. Her words, sometimes taken out of context, were printed on posters next to inspirational quotes. And that, too, is a kind of violence. Because Anne didn't ask to be a symbol. She asked to be heard. She asked for dignity, for peace, for the freedom to grow up. We must be careful not to turn victims into mascots, not to flatten them for comfort. Anne's story isn't just a tragedy. It's a responsibility. In the decades that followed, the world continued to struggle with memory. Holocaust denial became louder. Neo-Nazi groups used the internet to spread lies, and some began to question whether Anne Frank even existed. Imagine that. A girl who wrote her soul into paper, being told she was fiction. It happened. It still happens. That's why museums, survivors, and educators fight so hard to keep her story alive. Because forgetting is the final stage of genocide. But there's another danger. Not denial, not forgetting, but romanticizing. Too often, Anne's story is told as one of inspiration alone. Look how hopeful she was. See how brave she remained. As long as we remember her, evil can't win. But that's not entirely true. Anne died. Hope did not save her. Words did not protect her. Remembering her doesn't undo what happened. It only honors it. And that's enough, if we let it be honest. Anne's legacy is not that she stayed hopeful. It's that she told the truth while she still had breath to do it. And our job is to carry that truth forward. Today, in places like Syria, Sudan, Myanmar, and even within our own neighborhoods, children are still being targeted, still being locked up, still being called less than, still dying in silence. When we read in Frank's diary, we aren't just reading about the past. We're reading a mirror. And the question staring back is simple. What are we doing differently now? The most haunting page in Anne's diary is one that doesn't exist. It's the one she never got to write. The day after the last entry, August 5th, 1944. That's when the secret annex was raided. Someone betrayed them. We still don't know who for sure. The SS burst in. They tore the place apart. They dragged everyone out. Anne's diary was left behind, pages scattered, ink still drying. Miep Geese, one of the helpers, found it, hid it, protected it. She hoped to return it to in one day. She never got that chance. But still, the diary survived. So even though Anne's voice was silenced, it was not erased. And maybe that's the greatest act of defiance. In a world that tried to erase her, she wrote. In a regime that wanted silence, she spoke. In a system that treated her like nothing, she made herself unforgettable. And in doing so, she left us with a choice. Not just to remember, but to act. Because stories like hers don't just exist to move us. They exist to change us. August 4th, 1944. The sun had barely risen over Amsterdam. In the secret annex, the 8 hidden souls were stirring quietly, starting what they thought would be just another day of survival. Rationed food, silence during office hours, whispers after sunset. But outside, something was already wrong. A black car pulled up in front of 263 Prinsengracht. Inside were men in uniform, Dutch collaborators, working with the German security police. Their orders were simple: raid the building. Someone had tipped them off. Even now, historians argue about who it was: a jealous neighbor? An informant trying to save their own life? Whoever it was, it shattered everything. The door to the annex burst open, and Margot, Otto, Edith, the Van Pels family, and Fritz Pfeffer were all arrested. No time to say goodbye. No time to pack. No time to hide the diary. That small stack of handwritten pages, the one Anne had hoped to publish one day, was left behind on the floor, exposed and vulnerable. The dream of becoming a writer nearly ended there. They were taken to the Gestapo headquarters in Amsterdam, interrogated, processed, stripped of rights they never truly had, then transferred to Westerbork transit camp. It wasn't a death camp yet. It was a holding pen, a purgatory. They stayed there for nearly a month. Each day, the same question haunted them. When will the train come? And when it does, where will it go? September 3rd, 1944. The final transport from Westerbork to Auschwitz. The final train. And Frank was on it. Her mother, father, and sister too. So were the Van Pelses. So was Fritz. They were crammed into cattle cars. No seats. No food. No water. Just fear, raw and thick as smoke. 3 days. 3 nights. Children cried until they couldn't. Women fainted. Men prayed. Everyone waited. Until finally, Auschwitz. Auschwitz. The name itself is a wound. It wasn't just a camp. It was an industrialized death machine. More than 1.1 million people murdered there. Gas chambers, crematoriums, medical experiments, numbers tattooed on skin. Anne was only 15. And when she stepped off that train, she was no longer a child. At least, not in the eyes of her captors. She was property. The selection process was swift. A guard points left, you live. Right, you die. Children, elderly, the sick, all sent to the gas chambers. Anne's mother, Edith, was separated from her daughters. The men, Otto Frank, Mr. Van Pels, Fritz Pfeffer, were taken one way. The women, another. And yet, somehow, Anne and Margot stayed together. They were alive, but not safe. Never safe. In Auschwitz, and saw things no child should. Death carts rolling past every morning. Piles of corpses. Smoke from chimneys that never stopped. She was beaten, shaved, humiliated. But she still had her sister. Margot, always the quieter one, the more reserved. Together, they clung to memories of the annex. Of games they used to play. Of Meep and BEP and the helpers who risked everything to hide them. It was all so far away now. By October, the SS began transferring prisoners again. The Soviet army was advancing. They didn't want witnesses. So they moved many of the women, including, and in Margot, to Bergen-Belsen. It wasn't a death camp in name, but it was in reality. Bergen-Belsen was hell without fire. No gas chambers. Just starvation. Typhus. Neglect. Tents filled with thousands. Rats. Lice. Mud that never dried. By the time Anne and Margot arrived, they were skeletal. Their mother, Edith, was gone. She had died of starvation in Auschwitz in January 1945. Otto was still alive, but Anne didn't know. She believed she had lost everyone. In early 1945, typhus broke out across the camp. Bodies collapsed in rows. The sick lay next to the dead. Anne and Margot were infected. They had no medicine, no clean water, no hope. Margot died first. Her frail body gave out. A fall from a bunk bed broke her spirit, and then her life. And followed days later. Witnesses said she was delirious near the end, calling for her mother, crying for Margot, and then silence. She was 15 years old. Her body dumped into a mass grave. No headstone, no ceremony, no goodbye. 2 months later, British soldiers liberated Bergen-Belsen. But it was too late. All they found were bones and ashes and echoes. And Frank was gone, but not her voice. Back in Amsterdam, Miep Gies had kept the diary safe. She gave it to Otto Frank when he returned, the only one of the 8 to survive. He read it, and then he wept. The last words his daughter had written were still there, in ink, on the page. And slowly, the world began to read them too. And never meant to be famous. She meant to live, to travel, to write novels, to fall in love, to grow old. But in her absence, her words became a monument, one not made of stone, but of courage. When Otto Frank first opened the pages of his daughter's diary, he couldn't breathe. There, in her handwriting, was her world, frozen in ink. The jokes, the dreams, the fears, the quiet courage. He read it all in disbelief. Not just because of the pain, but because he didn't realize how much she had seen, how much she had felt, how much she had understood, and had written more than thoughts. She had written the soul of a generation silenced too soon. At first, Otto didn't know what to do with it. How do you publish the voice of a child who died? How do you share something so personal, so raw? But Anne had wanted it to be read. She wrote, in one of her final entries, "I want to go on living even after my death." She had edited her own diary in the annex, cutting entries, polishing others, preparing it for the world. This wasn't a private journal. It was a testimony, and Otto knew he had to honor that wish. In 1947, Het Achterwijs, The Secret Annex, was published in Dutch. At first, it sold modestly, a few thousand copies, some curious readers. But slowly, something began to happen. Letters poured in, people saying, "She reminded me of my daughter. She reminded me of me. I never knew Jews were people like us," and had pierced the veil of propaganda. She wasn't a statistic. She wasn't a ghost. She was a girl, with a crush, with acne, with ambition, and that simple truth changed everything. In 1952, the English translation was released, The Diary of a Young Girl. It exploded. Suddenly, and Frank was on the shelves of bookstores in London, New York, Sydney, Johannesburg. A voice that had been silenced in Bergen-Belsen was now being heard across continents. Schools adopted it into their curriculum. Parents gave it to their children. Writers quoted it. Leaders referenced it. And had become a symbol, not of death, but of defiant humanity. And yet, there were critics. Some said it was too naive, too sweet. But that's what made it powerful. Because in a world built on hatred, Anne's diary refused to become bitter. She wrote, "In spite of everything, I still believe that people are really good at heart." Those words, written by a girl surrounded by walls, hunted for her heritage, somehow still found grace. They've been printed on posters, tattooed on skin, etched in stone, and still debated. How could she believe that? After the betrayals? After the arrests? After the camps? Was it hope? Was it denial? Or was it a challenge? a challenge to us, to be better than the world that killed her. In the decades that followed, and story spread even further. Stage plays, films, TV specials. The 1959 film adaptation was nominated for 8 Academy Awards. Her words were being spoken in theaters filled with popcorn, but still, they struck deep. Because everyone, regardless of age, race, politics, could feel it, and could have been anyone's daughter, anyone's sister, anyone's friend. And that universality is what made her dangerous to those who preferred silence. There were attempts to ban the book. In some schools, conservative groups said it was too depressing. In others, they claimed it was inappropriate due to Anne's honest talk about her body, her feelings, her identity, and had written openly about her sexuality, about growing up, about womanhood. And for that, some wanted her erased again, but others fought back. Educators, historians, survivors. They said, this is exactly why we need her. Because the Holocaust wasn't just numbers. It was voices, and hers was still echoing. Otto Frank spent the rest of his life preserving Anne's legacy. He answered every letter sent to him, thousands, over decades. Children wrote to him from across the world. Some said they had never read a book before Anne's. Others said it made them want to write, or to fight injustice, or to learn history. Otto remarried, moved to Switzerland, and helped establish the Anne Frank Foundation. But he never recovered. How could he? Every birthday, every anniversary, every photograph was a reminder. He once said, it's a strange feeling to live when they did not. In 1960, the building at Prinsengracht 263, where the secret annex stood, was turned into a museum. People lined up for blocks to walk through those narrow halls, to stand in the space where she wrote, to touch the walls that once held her dreams. Today, over 1 million people visit the Anne Frank house each year, and every one of them, in some way, leaves different. Because walking through the annex isn't just about Anne, it's about us. Anne Frank's diary has been translated into more than 70 languages. It's sold over 30 million copies. It's been read in war zones, in classrooms, in bunkers, in jail cells. It's been smuggled across borders. It's been hidden from censors. It's been wept over by generations. It is one of the most important books of the 20th century, not because it explains genocide, but because it humanizes it. Because when you read her words, you're not reading about them. You're reading about you. You're reading about what it means to be young, to be scared, to be hopeful, to be alive. And you realize, if it could happen to her, it could happen to any of us. The world knew her name. But what about the others? For every Anne Frank, there were thousands more who left no words behind. No diary, no photographs, no record, just names etched into stone, or not remembered at all. That is the haunting truth. And is not special because she suffered. She is special because she was heard. But most were not. Let's go back to Amsterdam in the 1940s. A city filled with whispers, where neighbors looked through curtains and chose silence. People who once smiled at the Franks in the market crossed the street when they saw them wearing the yellow star. Some whispered support. Some turned away. But too many stood still. There were heroes, yes. People who hid Jews, forged documents, snuck food. Ordinary people who risked everything. But for every one of them, there were hundreds who said, it's not my business. I don't want trouble. It'll pass. It didn't. It never does. Miep Gies, the woman who helped hide the Franks, later said, I don't want to be called a hero. You don't need special training to help. You only need a good heart. She was just a secretary, but she became a lifeline. Every day, she smuggled food into the annex. Books, news, hope. And when the Gestapo raided the annex, she didn't run. She went back. She found the diary. She kept it safe. Because even when Anne was gone, her voice mattered. After the war, Miep gave the diary to Otto. She could barely speak when she handed it over. She said it felt like she was giving him back his daughter, piece by piece. And in a way she was. She was one of the few who refused to look away. But what about the others? What about the people who knew something was wrong and did nothing? This is the uncomfortable truth that N's story forces us to confront. The Holocaust didn't happen in secret. It happened in plain sight, on streets, in schools, in newspapers, and people watched. They watched as rights were stripped away, as shops were vandalized, as families disappeared, one by one. They watched. That's why N's diary isn't just a historical document. It's a mirror. It asks, what would you do? Not in theory, not in hindsight. Right now, would you help someone being hunted? Would you hide a neighbor? Or would you stay silent? Otto Frank, in his later years, said something chilling. I am not bitter, but I am angry. Angry that so many knew and said nothing. His pain wasn't just about losing his family. It was about betrayal, by a society, by a city, by friends, and had once written, no one has ever become poor by giving. She believed in kindness, even when the world proved otherwise. She hoped people would change, that her words might make a difference. But change is slow, and silence is contagious. In the years after the war, many survivors stayed quiet. They didn't write. They didn't speak. They carried their stories like wounds that never closed, because the world wasn't ready to hear. N's diary changed that. It opened a crack in the silence. It said, this happened. This was real. And you cannot look away. Today, we still wrestle with those same questions. What does it mean to be a bystander? When does neutrality become complicity? N's story has been used in protests, in human rights campaigns, in classrooms, because it forces us to see not just what happened, but how it happened. It wasn't just hatred that killed her. It was indifference. It was paperwork. It was people doing their jobs. It was a system fed by silence. A knock on the door. A list of names. A train that left on time. That's all it took. And now, we face new versions of the same old hatred. Different uniforms. Different slogans. Same poison. N's words still matter, not just as history, but as warning. Because evil doesn't always start with violence. Sometimes it starts with a joke, with a law, with silence. And wanted her diary to change hearts, to make people feel, to make them care. But she also knew not everyone would listen. She once wrote, who else but me is ever going to read these letters? The answer? Millions. People who cried, people who learned, people who chose to speak because she couldn't. And that is the power of testimony. Today, there are places in the world where books are banned, where truth is censored, where hate rises again. N's diary has been challenged in schools, called controversial, as if her words, her truth, are dangerous. And maybe they are. Dangerous to lies, to ignorance, to apathy, which is exactly why we must keep reading. And Frank's legacy isn't just her diary. It's every young person who reads it and says, I won't stay silent. It's every teacher who shares her story, every activist who quotes her, every voice that speaks out, even when it's hard. Because silence isn't neutral. It's deadly. And N knew that better than anyone. The war ended. The guns fell silent. The world breathed again. But not for everyone. For those who survived, the nightmare didn't end with liberation. It lingered. In memories. In silence. In the spaces where loved ones once lived. Because how do you rebuild when the foundation of your life has turned to ash? Otto Frank returned to Amsterdam. He stepped into the secret annex. Empty, cold, dust-covered. The furniture had been taken by the Nazis. The walls, stripped. Only pencil marks remained. Where N and Margot had tracked their height. He ran his fingers across them. And wept. He was the only survivor of the 8 people who had hidden there. 8 voices. 7 gone. Only one remained to carry them forward. He read N's diary in pieces. Not all at once. He couldn't. Some entries shattered him. Others felt like she was sitting beside him again. Her humor. Her hope. Her fire. He read the lines where she wrote about him. My father is the most adorable father in the world. And then the ones where she questioned him. Resented him. Loved him. She was a teenager, after all, alive on the page in a way that made the silence unbearable. Otto decided the world needed to see her. Not the edited version. Not just a sweet girl hiding in an attic. But the real and angry, complicated, brilliant. He worked tirelessly to publish her words. He faced rejection after rejection. Too depressing. Too political. Too soon. But he never stopped. He promised her. He would not let her disappear. Finally, in 1947, the first edition of Het Achterhuis, The Secret Annex, was published in Dutch. It sold modestly. Then it was translated. English, French, German, and suddenly, Anne's voice was everywhere. By the 1950s, schools were teaching her words. By the 1960s, there were plays, movies, and had become a symbol, a name that stood for millions who had none. But Otto knew the danger of that too. He worried the world would turn her into a saint and forget she was a girl. He often said, and was no angel. She had her moods, her tempers, but she was real, and in that realness was her power. Otto Frank dedicated the rest of his life to telling her story. He answered thousands of letters from students around the world. He visited schools. He met with world leaders. He built the Anne Frank House, turning the secret annex into a museum, so others could walk the same stairs, stand in the same rooms, feel the same silence. Because he believed, if people felt it, they might change. But not everyone wanted to feel. In the decades after the war, denial grew. Books claimed the Holocaust was a lie. Politicians questioned the numbers. Some even called Anne's diary a forgery. Otto was heartbroken. He spent years fighting in court to prove the diary was authentic, that his daughter had lived, had written, had died. He won, but the wounds reopened. Still, he pressed on. Until his final breath in 1980, Otto Frank carried the weight of memory. He once said, "To build a future, you must know the past. And to know the past, you must listen to those who lived it. And lived it. And through her, we do too." But what about the others? What about Margot? She was quieter than Anne. More serious. More private. Her writings didn't survive. Only a few lines in Anne's diary. A few photographs. A whisper in history. And yet, she mattered. She was 19 when she died in Bergen-Belsen, ravaged by typhus, buried in a mass grave. No marker. No headstone. Just a name we cling to. And Peter Van Pels? Anne's teenage crush? He died just weeks before liberation. Or Edith Frank, Anne's mother? She starved in Auschwitz. Refused to eat so her daughters might live. All gone. Each life, a universe erased. That's why the diary is not just a book. It's a resurrection. It brings Anne back, if only for a moment. It lets her speak, joke, dream. It defies the silence that tried to swallow her. In one of her last entries, Anne wrote, "In spite of everything, I still believe that people are really good at heart." People debate that line to this day. Was it naive? Was it hopeful? Was it written before she knew how bad things could get? No one knows. But maybe that's the point. Maybe belief in goodness is not about evidence. It's about choice. And chose to hope. And in doing so, she gave us a choice too. We can believe the world is broken and leave it that way. Or we can choose to fight for something better. To speak. To write. To remember. Because remembrance is resistance. Today, you can walk the streets of Amsterdam. Visit the annex. Touch the walls where Anne once stood. And feel it. The absence. The echoes. But also, the light she left behind. Because though her body was taken, her voice remains. And that voice continues to call us. Decades passed. Generations were born who never knew the sound of war sirens or the taste of fear in every meal. But Anne Frank remained. Her face, eternal at 13. Her words, ageless. In classrooms. In museums. On bookshelves. In the minds of millions. But something began to change. Anne's image, her very identity, started to fracture. She became a symbol. But symbols can be dangerous. They simplify. They strip complexity. They make people forget she was a real girl with dirty socks, arguments, bad days, and secrets. For many, and became the nice story of the Holocaust. The gentle entry point. The hopeful victim. But it wasn't soft. Her writing wasn't always gentle. She spoke of pain, of hatred, of rage. She questioned God. She criticized her family. She didn't always believe in people's goodness. The line, "I still believe people are really good at heart," was written before she knew the camps. Before the typhus. Before the starvation. And yet, it's the line people quote most. Because it's comforting. Because we want her to be a saint, not a mirror. And Frank is a mirror. One that reflects the best and worst in all of us. She was the teenager who held on to love, and the one who broke down sobbing from despair. She was human, and that is why she matters. Because if we reduce her to just hope, we lose the warning. We forget the cost. Anne's diary was never meant to be a monument. It was never meant to make us feel safe. It was meant to remind us what happens when ordinary people do nothing. In recent years, the world has changed again. Books are being banned. History is being rewritten. Holocaust denial is rising. And once again, Anne Frank is in the crosshairs. Some call her diary too political. Others claim it's inappropriate for children. Some say it paints certain groups unfairly. We are watching, in real time, as memory is erased. Not by fire this time, but by neglect, by bureaucracy, by silence. But silence is how it all began. Silence let hatred grow. Silence let the trains run. Silence let a 15-year-old girl die in a barrack filled with corpses. We cannot be silent now. And yet, in the darkness, there is light. Across the globe, children still read her words. They write essays. They draw her picture. They cry for someone who lived before their grandparents were born. In Tokyo, there's a library dedicated to her. In Buenos Aires, a museum. In the United States, her diary has never been out of print. Translated into over 70 languages. Read by more than 30 million people. That's more than a book. That's a resistance movement. Otto Frank once said, "To build a better world, we must listen to the voice of a young girl who lived in hiding." She knew more about humanity than most leaders ever will. And he was right. Anne's voice is not fading. It's growing. Not because she was perfect, but because she was real. What would Anne Frank say today? If she saw the world now, would she be proud of how far we've come? Or horrified by how far we haven't? Would she marvel at the technology in our hands? Or weep at the ways we use it to spread hate faster than ever? Would she see herself in the refugees, in the children locked in cages, in the silence of those who look away? And once wrote, "Whoever is happy will make others happy too." But happiness was not her legacy. Truth was, and Frank didn't die in vain. But she also didn't die for comfort. She died because a system of hatred went unchecked. Because neighbors stayed quiet. Because people chose safety over justice. And today, her image, sweet, smiling, and asks us a question. What would you do? Not what would you have done in 1942, but what will you do now? When hatred rises, when truth is threatened, when silence feels easier, will you close the book? Or will you carry her voice forward? Because Anne's story isn't finished. It lives in every act of courage. Every time someone says, "This isn't right." Every time someone chooses empathy over fear. The diary ends before her story does. But our story, the one that follows hers, is still being written. And what we choose to write now will decide if her voice becomes a whisper in history or a roar in the future. When the war ended in 1945, the world breathed out. Cities began to rebuild. Nations counted their dead. And survivors emerged, skeletal, silent, hollow-eyed. But for many, the war never really ended. Especially for those who had survived the camps. Especially for those who had lost everything and everyone. And Frank's name was not known in those first months. Her diary had not yet been published. Her grave had no marker. Her voice had not yet been heard. But Otto Frank, her father, was alive. and he was determined that her words would not be buried with her. After learning of his daughter's deaths, Otto returned to Amsterdam, to the annex, to the place where their laughter had once echoed through hidden walls. He found it preserved, almost untouched, but the silence was unbearable. Then he found the pages, loose sheets, notebooks, scraps. Anne's diary, hidden and saved by Miep Geese and others, was waiting for him. And as he read, he wept. Otto Frank later said, "I didn't know my daughter. Not really. Not until I read her words." He was reading not just a diary. He was reading the soul of a child. Her dreams, her fears, her frustrations, her fire. And he knew, in that moment, that the world needed to hear her too. But publishing it wasn't easy. Many publishers rejected it. Too Jewish, too depressing, too political, too soon. But Otto persisted. And in 1947, just 2 years after the war ended, Het Achterhuis, The Secret Annex, was published in Dutch. It didn't explode. It didn't become a sensation overnight. But slowly, painfully, it spread, translated into French, then German, then English. By 1952, it reached the United States. And there, something unexpected happened. America embraced Anne, not just as a victim, not just as a Jewish girl, but as a voice of lost innocence. In a country grappling with McCarthyism, with segregation, with its own post-war reckoning, and became a kind of moral compass. But also, again, a sanitized one. Broadway adapted her story into a play. Hollywood turned it into a film. And each time, they softened her. They removed the darker parts, the anger, the complexity, the fire, because it was easier to package her that way. But Otto never stopped fighting to keep her real, to keep her human, to keep her voice authentic. Meanwhile, survivors across Europe faced a different battle. They returned to cities that no longer remembered them, to homes occupied by strangers, to countries that didn't want reminders of what had happened. Many Holocaust survivors were seen as burdens, as damaged, as better left in silence. They bore their tattoos like ghosts, their memories too sharp for polite conversation. But Anne gave them a kind of permission. She gave the world a way to begin listening. In the 1960s, amid the civil rights movement, students began reading her diary in American classrooms. In the 70s, Holocaust education took root in German schools. In the 80s, a new generation discovered her words, and her image became a symbol not just of loss, but of warning. But warnings are easy to ignore, and memory is fragile. As the decades passed, new waves of denial emerged. Some called her diary a fake. Others questioned the camps themselves. Some simply shrugged and said, "It's all in the past." But history is never just the past. It's the choices we carry into the present. Otto Frank died in 1980. He had spent the last 35 years of his life dedicated to his daughter's legacy, to preserving the annex, to speaking at schools, to keeping Anne's words alive. He died knowing that millions had read her, that millions more would, but also fearing that people would forget what it meant. After his death, the Anne Frank House in Amsterdam became more than a museum. It became a pilgrimage. Visitors walk the same narrow stairs, stand in the secret rooms, look at the wall where Anne pinned her movie star pictures. They touch the air. They try to imagine. But some things can't be imagined. In recent years, Holocaust education has faced new challenges. Fewer survivors remain. Social media spreads disinformation faster than truth. Political extremism is on the rise, again, and the same words are being heard. It can't happen here. It's not the same. Don't be so dramatic. But those words have been said before. And Anne's story shows exactly where they lead. In Germany, new laws were passed to protect Holocaust memory. In Israel, Anne is studied alongside Elie Wiesel and Primo Levi. In Argentina, her diary is used to teach empathy in juvenile detention centers. In South Africa, post-apartheid truth commissions quoted her words. Her reach is global. Because truth is borderless. And Frank didn't see herself as a prophet. She didn't think her words would last. She wrote for herself, for the hope of a better future. But her voice became the voice of 6 million others. Not because she was chosen, but because she wrote, and because someone listened. We are the listeners now. And the question remains, will we just admire her? Or will we act on what she tried to say? There is a reason why in Frank's photo, taken when she was just 11 years old, still stops people in their tracks. It's not the pose. It's not the lighting. It's not even the context. It's the eyes. Those wide, open, quietly wondering eyes. Innocent, but aware. Hopeful, yet guarded. Eyes that seem to say, I know more than I'm allowed to say. Because she did. By the time she was 11, and had already been labeled, already been feared, already been denied entry into swimming pools, schools, theaters, buses, she had been told, by her own country, that she was different, dangerous, unworthy. But her diary doesn't echo hate. It radiates thought. It radiates humanity. She writes about the same things most teenagers still do. Crushes, annoying parents, wanting to be seen, needing to be understood. She writes with fire, with humor, with anger, with grace. She wasn't perfect. She was alive. And that's the point. History often turns victims into statues, into soft-edged myths. And didn't want to be a myth. She wanted to be heard. And she has been, by millions, across generations, across continents. But now we face a dangerous turn. Because as Anne becomes more iconic, she risks becoming invisible again. You see her face on tote bags, on murals, on posters. And yet, fewer people read her actual words. Fewer people understand the context. The real girl. The danger she faced. The system that killed her. That's how memory fades. Not with a bang, but with overexposure. With sentiment replacing substance. With comfort replacing confrontation. And Frank didn't want to make us feel comfortable. She wanted to wake us up. And maybe we need to be shaken again. Because the same signs are appearing. Nationalism. Scapegoating. Book bans. Censorship. Demonization of minorities. Dehumanization through language. And wrote, I keep my ideals, because in spite of everything I still believe that people are really good at heart. It's the line most quoted. It's also the most misunderstood. Because she wrote that before she was betrayed, before she was starved, before she died nameless in a disease-ridden camp. And still she clung to hope. That is what makes her story so unbearable. And so necessary. The question we now face isn't whether we remember Anne Frank. It's whether we understand her. Whether we use her legacy, or simply admire it from a safe distance. Whether we teach her words, or sanitize them from mass consumption. Whether we protect her image, or protect what she stood for. Today, in a world flooded with information, outrage, and distraction, silence still matters. So does stillness. So does choosing kindness when cruelty is easier. So does speaking up when it's unpopular. So does remembering the names no one else will say. And Frank's story doesn't end in the annex. It doesn't end in Bergen-Belsen. It doesn't even end in the publication of her diary. It ends with us. With what we do. With how we live. With how we protect truth, even when it's inconvenient. Especially when it's inconvenient. Every time we choose empathy over apathy, dialogue over dismissal, memory over denial, we keep her alive. Every time we listen to the voiceless, shelter the displaced, challenge the oppressors, we echo what Anne stood for. Not just survival, but human dignity. So here's the truth. Anne Frank was not just a victim. She was a thinker, a dreamer, a challenger. A human being caught in a system that demanded silence. And she refused. With a pen, with paper, with honesty. Her voice wasn't loud, but it has never stopped ringing. Let it ring through us now. Let it remind us that behind every photo is a heartbeat. Behind every name, a future once imagined. Behind every page, a choice. And maybe the final question isn't just, what happened to Anne Frank? Maybe it's this. What will we do with the world she never got to see? Because she believed in it, even when it gave her every reason not to. That's not weakness. That's not naivete. That's courage. And that courage is ours to carry forward.